Welcome to the Create the Life You Want podcast, where we break down the journey of people just like you going from dream to ownership in business acquisitions, franchises, and startups. I'm your host, Jeremy Ames. Today's episode is brought to you ad-free by Guidant Financial. Guidant is America's leading company helping aspiring entrepreneurs use retirement funds to buy or start businesses. If you're committed to buying or starting a business, you can find out more about your funding options by going to www.guidantfinancial.com. That's Guidant financial.com. Now, let's get started with the show. Welcome, everyone, to the Create the Life You Want podcast. Today, I am joined by Russ Broome, a recent entrepreneur that lived in the corporate world for 27 years before he decided to make the jump and do something a little crazy. And we're going to find out about that here. So, Russ, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your pre-business ownership life looked like? You said 27 years spent in a corporate career. What was that, and how did you get into it?
I was in a single industry for my entire career prior to getting out of college up until I chose to go into business for myself. And it was in the plastics industry, up and down the supply chain, from engineering to manufacturing to sales and marketing, business development. And I got into that industry because my father was in that industry for 40 years prior to me. And I had met a lot of contacts and had a lot of name recognition from him. And so I jumped in. I went to school for mechanical engineering at NC State, which led right into me being in engineering to start with, and then started branching out into manufacturing and then into sales and marketing and the more commercial side of things. But I wanted to go 3 more years. I had 2 daughters that were in college, and I was my plan, which never works out, but my plan was to get them out of college and then do a semi-retirement into something that I chose to do a little bit earlier. But my father passed away. My other career mentor, who I was working for at the time, passed away. My mom got sick, and I just said, life's too short. Let's jump ship now. And that happened to also be right in the pandemic. So that's when I took the leap and
So good timing.
Where I am now. Yeah, right. Planning is what happens, or life is what happens when you're busy planning. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur? When did that bug first hit you? Because it seemed like it had been in there.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what struck me, but early on in my life, I begged my father to let's go do something on our own. Let's go start a business. Take everything you do great for somebody else and let's go do it for ourselves. And he never had the courage or the willingness to jump out on our own. So I followed in his footsteps and worked for the other man for that whole 27 years. But I always had the itch. And I did leave a company, a very large company, in the middle of my career, and I had a 2-year non-compete. And when I did that, I chose to take that 2-year non-compete and go into business for myself. But it was at a point in my marriage with young kids that it just was killing me and it was killing the relationship. And so as soon as the 2-year non-compete was up, I jumped right back into the safety and security of a corporate job with all the benefits and the steady checks and all that. But I did do my own thing for a couple of years, and it consisted of a little bit of headhunting, as well as a manufacturer's rep for some of the large equipment firms that I had always been a customer of. And it was fine for 2 years, but like I said, it took a toll on me, and I was a little young, and my wife convinced me to jump back into that security of a corporate role.
Well, let's back up then, because it sounds like you kind of always wanted to be out on your own and had tried to push your dad in the early stages. You took a little bit of time in between jobs to go after it, and it didn't work out the way that you expected. So why don't you dissect for us, looking back now on those 2 years when you started your own thing, what did you do well, and what do you know now that you would have done differently?
Well, it all happened very quickly, so I didn't take my normal route of planning it sufficiently. I realized I wanted to exit my current role, realized there was a non-compete, which would make me not be able to stay in the industry. And instead of jumping ship to another industry, I knew that I could stay in the industry, keep my contacts alive, but not default on that non-compete. I think I just did it too quickly. I didn't do the proper planning. I didn't have a board of advisors. I didn't have anybody to really help and consult with me. I just jumped in with both feet, which is strange to say because my father would have never done that.
Yeah.
So, that was probably my mistake, is just jumping in the deep end too quick before I really learned how to swim.
So it sounds like you saw an easy path to starting something that wasn't going to violate your non-compete, but allowed you to stay in an industry you knew well with contacts that you knew well. Typically, that's a good recipe for success. So what didn't work about that other than just the planning?
Well,
What did you miss in the planning that you would have caught if you'd been more thoughtful?
the initial avenue I took was recruitment, and it took me about 6 months to realize I did not want to be in recruiting, because when I had been in sales in the commercial roles, you're selling an entity that doesn't leave the table. When you're in recruitment, you're selling an entity, and that entity can leave you just as well as the customer you're selling to can leave you. So it just got very frustrating, and I wasn't passionate about recruiting. And so when I jumped ship there, I had already actually, one of my recruiting jobs that I was trying to fulfill was for an equipment sales rep. And I started realizing that's not going to blow my non-compete. I knew the space. It was equipment that was in that plastics industry that I'd worked for already for a while. And so I became a manufacturer's rep for principals that I had already worked with as a customer of. I had bought their stuff. And being an engineer, I could walk the walk and talk the talk from a technical side, and they were happy to bring me on to sell their equipment that I had been buying. The problem with that is the average sales cycle is about 18 months to 2 years.
Ooh.
So you bust your tail working on finding customers for your $1 million of equipment, and it takes, a year to build it, and then 6 months to condition it in their shop. And then when they finally accept it, 30 to 60 days after that, you get your commission check. And my stay-at-home wife at the time of 2 young daughters was not happy about waiting for those commission checks that were going to take that long. So I did do it for 2 years. I ran out my non-compete, immediately jumped back into the career that I previously had, but didn't make a whole lot of money in that 18 months and 2 years that I spent during that non-compete.
Yeah, so what I heard in that story, Russ, is that you jumped into an industry that you had never done before, the recruiting side. You were in the plastics industry, right? So you knew the customers, but in terms of the job, that was a new job for you, and you just didn't like it. It wasn't fit for where you were fulfilled. And so it pretty quickly burned you out in terms of the
Yep.
time and effort you were putting into it. Okay, so
Correct.
contrast that for us with you decide life is too short after all these unfortunate external things happen in your life with people you love and their health. How did you approach this second stab at business ownership differently?
So the second time, I was a little more patient. I I always had this desire to, when I retired, have a small neighborhood bar that would kind of run itself, but it would give me kind of a hobby on the side, and obviously be profitable. But it was just somewhere to go and to keep camaraderie in the community versus the global camaraderie that I had in the corporate jobs. I wanted to immerse myself in my community and do things that would serve my immediate friends in the neighborhoods that I was in. So when I left corporate America during the pandemic, and I was in a global sales role at the time that pretty much plummeted because of the pandemic, it was a mutual departure of they couldn't keep me on the payroll because we weren't able to sell anything at the time. And I was ready to do something else because of all the catastrophe that was happening in my personal life. So I left in a summer, and I spent until the following summer a year, because I had, at that point, I had reserves, cash reserves in place, and I could support myself and my family during that time. And I really planned it out better than I did the first. I decided to go ahead and start that next phase of life, which I call semi-retirement. I was 50 years old. I wanted to go ahead and find a neighborhood bar and run that instead of jumping back into corporate. And nobody knew how long the pandemic was going to last, but the pandemic also took a toll on the neighborhood bars. They were all shutting down.
Yeah.
So I found this concept of a bottle shop, and in North Carolina, that means you have retail where you sell fine wine and craft beer retail to take home, and you also open a bar and you have on-site consumption with hospitality like you would a regular bar. So those establishments actually went up during the pandemic because people are going to consume their favorite alcohol. They just can't go to a bar and do it. They're going to come and get their favorite stuff and take it home. So that's when I went down the path that year that I was spending during the pandemic to find exactly what I wanted to do, which led me into the spot I am today.
So you knew you wanted to do a bottle house, or this was an insight you had as you were seeing the impacts of COVID on the type of business that you were drawn to?
I just wanted a bar.
Yep.
And the COVID analysis that I did, I realized that the bars weren't working during the pandemic and were not pandemic proof, but the retail side was. It was recession proof, pandemic proof. And I learned about this bottle shop concept in North Carolina where people sold the high end beer and wine, but also had a bar in the back. So I could do the retail, stay alive during a crisis like a pandemic, but always have that bar to fall back on when it opened back up.
Yeah, that community piece that was drawing you to that concept in the first place. So,
Right.
Russ, you're an engineer by trade, so I am excited to hear about your analysis of what you did here. So, why don't you walk us through some details of what did you look at? Where did you go for information? How did you figure out what was going to make sense?
So I started analyzing, I'm in the Raleigh, North Carolina area. So I started analyzing bars and bottle shops in my area because I wasn't going to move. I had no desire to move.
Yeah.
And I realized very quickly that there were probably 20 bottle shops just in the Raleigh area. So did I really want to be a Me Too and start something brand new off the cuff and have to spend all that capital trying to catch up to all my competitors? And in my investigation, and I would literally go to these places and sit and have a drink and spend a couple hours watching what was working well, not working well at all these future competitors. And one of the ones that I found actually where my family is, which is a couple hours west of here, they were a franchise, and he had 4 successful locations in North Carolina, but nothing in Raleigh. So I talked to him about being a franchise of his because his name was established, his model was established, and I could very quickly duplicate that in Raleigh without having to reinvent the wheel myself.
Yeah.
And we had paperwork in front of us, and I was actually getting ready to sign the paperwork when an email popped up on my desk. I guess because I had done so much Google searching, but an email popped up from an unsolicited broker saying, Raleigh's oldest bottle shop for sale. Inquire here. And I thought, man, that is spooky because I don't know who this broker is. I wasn't signed up to get any kind of messages, but there it was. I contacted him, and then that was already one of the bottle shops that I had been analyzing,
Yeah.
but it was the first bottle shop in Raleigh, and it was up for sale. So I met with the broker and the owner, and I think that was in March, and we inked the deal in June of that year. And I bought an existing bottle shop that already had its name recognition. It was successful, had its customer base. It had a model that was working, and I didn't have to go the franchise route, and I didn't have to start from scratch myself.
Interesting. So you sort of went the full gamut. You had decided on the concept. You wanted to have this bar community. What you experienced in COVID led you to the bottle shop concept. You knew you wanted to do that. And originally you were contemplating a startup and having to compete with these until you found the franchise, and then eventually got spun into an acquisition. So walk us through, how did you think about the difference between doing a startup versus franchising it versus acquiring an existing business, and why did you ultimately make the decision you did?
Well, I had the desire to do my own thing, but I realized there was going to be an uphill battle creating your own Me Too business when there's already 20 others out there. And I thought it would be a real struggle to get off the ground and catch up to these other competitors starting from scratch. That's why when I didn't give up on that idea, but I ran across this franchise in the middle of that investigation that said, wow, here I can still kind of do my own thing, but I've got the backing of a franchise that's already successful. and he needs a partner in Raleigh. So it just kind of all made sense. And I thought that was, just the perfect thing landed in my lap until right before I signed the papers, a more perfect thing landed in my lap.
Interesting. So you said you did a ton of Google searches. I'm curious, other than going to these shops, sitting down, and just observing what you saw that looked like it was working well, not working well, what other kind of research did you do, and what other insights did that drum up for you that impacted how you approached the business search?
Well, there are ways to, I would say, get in the ballpark of how financially successful small businesses are on the web. And so I started trying to find out, this one versus that one. How well are they doing financially? How long have they been in business? How many times have they changed ownership? So in addition to physically visiting the brick and mortar and watching it operate, I was doing research on them the best I could without, invading their privacy, but what's already out there on the web. And it kind of aligned, oh, these were my top three, and two of those are actually two of the most profitable. Or while I really like this one, I don't know how he's still in business when you look at, his history. So I just added that element of all the information that's out there for the public to see, in addition to visiting it firsthand and laying eyeballs on the brick and mortar and watching the operation.
How did you figure that out? How did you figure out which three were the most profitable?
I just got a shovel and started digging, and there's a lot of websites and a lot of information, and that's why I said ballpark. I don't know how exactly perfect it is, but with the Better Business Bureau and other websites, you can hone in on some ballpark financials, and you can see if they're doing $1 million or if they're doing $50,000. And again, that might not be perfect data, but it's relative when you're comparing, a dozen or more competitors from one another.
So walk us through the logic of how you determined that these two or three were the most profitable. You're going to the Better Business Bureau and you're saying, hey, these ones have 10x the number of reviews or complaints, or what were the things that you put together that made you feel more confident about certain locations versus others?
Yeah, I had a whole spreadsheet. So again, I'm an engineer, so everything has to go in a damn spreadsheet.
Yeah, spill the beans, Russ. I'm going to keep asking you the questions till you actually give us the details, man.
So I kept up with everyone's Google rating. I looked at how many followers they had on social media. I looked at how many negative reviews they might have had, and are they serious, or was this just a troll that was, so I took all that into account. I looked at how long they had been in business. Was this the original owner that had been able to make it work for 5, 8, 10 years, or does it look like they changed ownership and changed the name 5 times in 10 years? That kind of gives you a warm and fuzzy or not. And then I would a lot of times just go in as a patron and start talking to the owner, and if he was like pulling his hair out with frustrations, and you could tell if they saw a darkness at the end of their tunnel, or they were just happy as a lark doing what they were doing, and you knew they were having fun and making money and were successful. So I think without them knowing that I was really investigating them,
Yeah.
they were willing to share with a patron, and a lot of them are proud of their business, like I am. I mean, you have someone come in that asks questions, you're either going to be very proud to talk with them, or you're going to say, man, I don't want to talk about this,
Yeah.
and it just added another soft point of data. But I really, I had no coaching on that. Nobody told me. I didn't read a book on go do this, that, and the other in this certain order. I just started, like I say, I grabbed a shovel and started digging, because this was a hospitality, bars, alcohol sales, whatever you want to call it, was a new industry for me because I had been in a single industry for 27 years.
Did you find any place where they posted alcohol sales data through the state or anything like that? Or infer it from other things?
You can find that demographic data, especially if you're working with a real estate broker. They have access, and there's a couple of websites that you can go to get demographic data on a neighborhood, not for an establishment. Like I couldn't pull up a competitor and analyze his alcohol sales, but I could take a zip code or a neighborhood and understand, the average age, the median income, how much money they spend on alcohol versus how much money they spend on another subject matter. And so that was some of what I did too, especially when I was looking to buy a place. Hey, what's the average income there? How
Yeah.
much does that neighborhood spend on alcohol? What percentage of their income? So that played into my decisions. But at the end of the day, when one popped up for sale, there wasn't any other choices for sale at the moment. So, but
Yeah.
it happened to be in a great zip code with a great median income, with obvious money was spent on alcohol that I was looking to get into. So I knew it wasn't a wrong neighborhood and plus that establishment was the first bottle shop concept to land in Raleigh back in 2012. And it was still in business with the original owner. So those
Yeah.
were all pluses in my spreadsheet, if you will.
Yeah. So when you were looking at some of that demographic data by zip codes, did you have some way that you tiered it or ranked it or said, hey, I'm not willing to go below a certain threshold? How'd you decide what was good?
That's a good question. It was flying by the seat of my pants, and without being an expert in that field or having any coaching, I just had to kind of be subjective about it. And
Did you do it like a Rorschach test at the eye doctors where it's like this one's better than that one?
a little bit that played
Okay.
into it. Yeah, it was a soft analysis, but it gave me comfort levels, or it gave me clear indicators. I want to stay clear of that type of establishment or that neighborhood, if you will, in the
Got it.
Raleigh area.
So you had two or three of these that when you went through your spreadsheet of all the different things you're looking at, from customer reviews to demographics or whatever, there were just a few that had all greens, and then all the other ones had question marks where you at least were pausing. Hey, this one had
Yep.
three owners, so what do I not know?
And then I had some clear red stoplights as well, saying, okay, put that one to the bottom of the list and keep the data, but don't, it wasn't in consideration.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear. So you went into these bottle shops and you start talking to these owners. What kind of questions did you ask them, and what were the most surprising answers that you got?
Oh, wow. You're taking me back 4 years ago now.
I think this is an important question, Russ, because I think one of the things people really struggle with is how do I evaluate or know if a business is good, and how do I figure out if an industry is the right one? So I'm super interested in your process of what you went through and the kind of things you learned, because I think it's brilliant to go sit at different competitors and just try and understand, like, what things do people do well, what do customers seem to be responding to, how many people are coming in the door. And I think it's brilliant to start having conversations with an owner and see what they'll tell you. I'm just curious, what did you talk about? What did you learn?
Well, it's interesting how that developed. Initially, I was just popping in these places, blindly talking to the bartenders.
So so when you first went into these establishments, you started talking to the bartenders at first. So walk us through some of those scenarios of what you did, how you got to the owner, what kind of questions you asked.
Right. So initially, I would just pop in and I'd be talking to a bartender, a random bartender. And after a couple of weeks of that, I realized I wasn't getting good information. It wasn't even information I was willing to put on my spreadsheet, if you will,
Yeah.
because you'd get a disgruntled employee, or you'd get a young lady that was just looking to make the big tips. And I just didn't value that information. So I realized I'll sit at home a week and I'll call these places after I find out who the owner is. And I'll just say, hey, is Randy in? No, he won't be in until Friday. He opens at Friday at noon. Well, there you go. I'd go visit that one Friday at noon. And I would walk in and just be surprised when the guy said, I'm Randy, the owner. And I'd say, oh, that's cool. How long you been doing this? And I would just strike up a conversation, and you'd know in the first 5 minutes if he was eager to talk to you. Especially, I would never do this if the bar was busy. But I realize owners typically will go when the bar is not real busy, and then when it gets busy, they have bartenders come in. So I would catch them at a time where they were relaxed, they weren't strapped for time, and I would just find out he's the owner, be very appreciative of him spending time with him, compliment him on his place. And you can tell in the first 5 minutes if he's proud of his place and he's doing well because he's happy to talk about it. If
Interesting.
if he would rather be an absentee owner because the place is about to fall apart and it's not successful, he doesn't really want to talk about it. And so I just, that was another piece of soft data But the owners, that I did talk to, and they were friendly and welcoming and happy to lift their skirt, if you will. It was just very interesting with some of the stuff that you'd pull out of that.
Okay, what was the most interesting piece of feedback or information you got in one of these conversations with an owner?
Because it was during the pandemic, we were often talking through masks. And some of the stuff that really surprised me was how the bar owner was dealing with all the regulation that was happening during the pandemic. And half of them would even say, "Do you mind if I take my mask off so we can talk more direct?" And we were already 6 feet apart and doing all that. So and as the pandemic started to wind down, you'd get more opportunity to be a little less, or they would be a little less critical of it. But early on, bar owners were really frustrated and really laying it out there. And I was surprised how honest they were being about how fed up they were about being controlled. Their livelihood was at risk because of something like that. And, I think had I not been doing that through the pandemic, I would have had a completely different answer to that question. But I think that was really catching me off guard was, wow,
Yeah.
I didn't really think about how this was affecting, a small business owner like this.
Did it change any of your approach to becoming a business owner? I mean, you've talked
Well,
about go ahead.
it definitely took me away from the even the inclination that I would have strictly a bar. And
Yeah.
it cemented the fact that I would have a bottle shop concept and have that opportunity to sell retail and put cases of wine in someone's trunk versus only being a bar that could only serve an open drink at a bar in a facility, which was outlawed, at that time.
Yeah. Interesting. And you still have no idea how this particular broker got your contact information.
I really don't. I absolutely don't. And it
It's
had to have been, maybe I would get on mailing lists of those competitors. So most of them had social media and they had an email newsletter, and you sign up here and get our weekly announcements. So I did a lot of that with an obscure personal email that was just kind of set up for this purpose. So I probably put my email address out there enough that somebody sold their list to a broker, or a broker already had access to their list or something. I don't know. That's probably how it happened, because it was too ironic.
Well, what I take from that is there's real value when are in the search process of just putting it out there as much as possible, what you're trying to do and getting in those channels, because you never know what opportunities are going to come up, come your way. If that email hadn't popped in for you, you'd be telling us a very different story potentially about what your path of business
Absolutely.
should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you only get present day information when you go into a brick and mortar. When you sign up and get their newsletter, you're getting weekly information of new stuff they may be doing, whether it's a live music event or a wine tasting, that you didn't see when you went in there on a Friday at noon. But because I was getting those emails, it was just adding more ideas and more things that looked attractive, or, oh man, I would never do that. I won't mention some of the things that came across that I immediately X'd off my list, but you find out things that you might want to do in the future and things you definitely don't want to do in the future.
Yeah, can you give us an example of one idea that you just blatantly stole that you saw in one of these things that you thought, that's brilliant, I'm going to do that?
Uh, well, the live music, it's a little bit of a risk because you're paying a third party to come in, and sometimes you don't know if you're going to have a great turnout that night that covers the cost and then some, or if you're going to see a loss that night because you paid this band and nobody showed up. So I think the live music was something that was really hitting home as something that's working for the people that were doing it. And now I have live music booked every Saturday night, and it may be a solo artist, a duo, or even a 3 or 4 piece band that comes out and plays on my patio in the summers. So
Yeah.
when I first initially thought of a bottle shop, I didn't think about live music, but that started popping up on the more successful ones as something that I definitely wanted to include in my going forward.
Love it. Let's switch gears a little bit, Russ, and talk about the transaction. So you get this email from this business broker about this bottle shop. You already presumably know a bit about this bottle shop. You've been in there, you've got your spreadsheet, you know some things about the demographics. What kind of information did you look at, and how did you evaluate that bottle shop before deciding to move forward and put an offer? So walk us through that time between March when you get that email and June when you're signing that paperwork to buy the business.
So that's an easy question to answer. I had a friend who was in my plastics industry who had left about 5 years before I did, and he started out in school as a chemical engineer, but very quickly started taking classes and was pursuing a law degree. He is a connoisseur, if you will, of craft beer. So he had this idea, and that's why I knew he and I would be friends. He had this idea of starting his own law practice specifically focused on alcohol law in North Carolina. And I'm not sure where you are, but North Carolina has some of the most antiquated and complicated laws around alcohol than anywhere in the country.
Okay.
So he saw an opportunity to capitalize on that because he already had a passion for craft beer and he wanted to be an attorney. Hey, let's marry those two together. So now he owns the Beer Law Center in Raleigh, North Carolina.
So he owns the Beer Law Center, and you have this friend who owns the Beer Law Center. So you immediately went to him and then did what?
I said, hey, I'm looking at getting into bottle shop concept, which he was very familiar with. I have an opportunity to acquire this existing business. He already knew about the business, and he agreed to kind of be my attorney and review, because the seller had a broker, which was his agent. I brought my friend, who's an attorney, as my agent to the table, and he was really able to scrutinize the deal and show me the pros and cons and renegotiate or ask for different things that weren't in the initial offer. So he really guided me. And he was the one that said, you need to get a board of advisors. So grab your banker, find a CPA you want to work with, bring him in. Get another advisor, which is just passionate about bellying up to a bar and fine wine and craft beer. And let's the 4 or 5 of us meet once a month to talk about this after you do the acquisition. So in doing that, I found a CPA, and the CPA was the one that really referred me to the Rob's concept, which is how that all folded in, which I'm sure you were going to ask at some point here, but that I didn't even know about it till then. But my grabbing that attorney, who was a good friend and a good consult, advised me to pull more experts into the equation, and that's how I ended up and then now talking to you 4 years later.
Yeah, interesting. So he says get a board of advisors. So you find a CPA, you've got an attorney already, you find someone else who has real understanding of the market and a personal interest as a consumer, and you put these people together, and that becomes your sort of brain trust. It sounds like you didn't even figure out the financing until after you had already decided, hey, I'm going to buy this business. So why don't you walk us through that? Let's talk first about how you negotiated to and decided this is the right price to pay for the business, and then how you figured out, okay, how am I going to pay for this? What's the right way to structure this?
So again, this is 4 years ago, but the gist of it was the initial number that was on the broker's solicitation. My attorney right out of the bag said that's too high, but of course they're going to shoot up there hoping they get what they want. So we started analyzing. At that point, once you sign a non-disclosure with them, they start sharing financials, and you get to really peel back the onion and see what's made this business. And what we found out was the owner who started it was very passionate about it. He was a craft beer guy, and it started as a craft beer store. Then he added wine later on. He realized there were people coming in every day saying, why don't you sell wine? He added wine, and then he added a tasting bar. He did not want an on-site consumption bar per se, but he had to have a tasting bar so that people could taste the wine, try different beers, and would help them take home stuff they really liked versus taking a risk on it. So that's how his model developed. But we found out, looking at his profitability statement each month or each year, sorry, it wasn't worth what he was asking. So my attorney and my CPA helped me, sift through those numbers. Because again, I'm an engineer. I'm not a finance guy.
Yep.
It was a little scary for me, but they helped comb through the numbers and say, hey, this is a much more fair market value of this. This is what you ought to go in. And of course, we went in under that, knowing that we would be pushed up. So I think we met in the middle. Both sides felt like they were giving up something, and because I was looking at taking my savings to do this, but my CPA, who introduced me to the ROBS concept, and I started doing more research around it, and I think I talked to one of his other clients that had done it. It just seemed like a safer way to dive in and still have reserves on the side, and that's what led me. But it all happened pretty quick. It happened between March and June, so it's a pretty fast pace for all that to.
You had mentioned earlier that it was a little bit scary. So why don't you talk about what it was that you were fearing, and then how you got over that fear through your work with the attorneys and the CPAs to scrape through the financials?
Well, I think it goes back to that entrepreneurial spirit that I always had, and I always begged my dad to join me in some venture. I wanted that, and I wanted to get in those waters, but it was a scary endeavor. I mean, I'm a very careful guy. But once I started seeing their approval, if you will, them saying, hey, I think this is a good deal, and hey, I think this fits the bill, and it's relatively safe. And the ROBS kind of gave me a way to do it where I wasn't just depleting my savings either.
Yeah, why don't we talk about that for a minute? Because I think you said something that's going to sound counterintuitive to most people. You said, I learned I could use my retirement funds to invest in this business, and that felt like a safer bet. I think a lot of people, when they think about using retirement funds to invest in a business, they think, wow, that sounds really risky. So why don't you explain your thinking and why that ended up being the best choice for you?
Well, the way I simplified it for myself was, instead of going to a bank to get a loan and owing that bank back and paying that bank back with interest, I was basically borrowing from myself and paying myself back. And while the stock market was very good at the time that I jumped out, there was an election coming up. We were right in the middle of that 2020 election that I felt safe. Now, I don't want to get political on here, but the election did not go the way I thought it was going to go. But I didn't know that when, this was all going down, when I was doing all my analysis. Then when the election happened and it didn't go the way I thought it would go, I was assuming that the stock market was going to tank. And not tank, but it would be on the decline. So I said, hey, I've done well with my 401k. I think it's probably going to decline. Why don't I exit my 401k at a high point and then start paying that 401k back as it starts to grow again? That was my analysis, and that's what, I won't say experts around me, but people that were advising me, they saw that as an opportunity that wasn't high risk, if you will. There's risk in every decision, but we were convincing ourselves that it was relatively low risk.
Yeah. And just to clarify for any of the listeners or viewers, when someone uses a rollover for business startups, they're not actually borrowing the money. Your retirement plan is essentially investing in the business. So it becomes a shareholder or a co-founder in the business, in your case, Russ. So you use this rollover, and that allowed you to keep more cash on the sidelines and reserves. Did you ever need to tap into that? Did that end up being something that you've had to use, or everything was pretty smooth sailing once you bought the business and took over?
Yes, I did need to tap into that, but it was not immediate. And we can get into those details if you want to, but when I bought the business, I assumed the last year of an existing lease. So I got assigned the lease, and there was only 1 year left on, I think
Yes.
he had a 5-year extension. So I had 1 year of his lease left. So I was locked into points of that lease that I didn't particularly like or agree with or wouldn't have signed off on originally. But it limited my outdoor patio space, and it limited some of the on-site consumption and things that landlord, and it was a conglomerate, huge landlord out of New York City,
Yeah.
which had no personal attachment to me or my business. They were strictly bean counters up in New York. And so I couldn't get around any of the lease stipulations that maybe a small local guy would have let me massage a little bit as a new owner. But when that 1 year lease was almost up, the landlord explained to me that they were looking to bring a grocery store into my shopping center. And while the grocery store was much more important to that landlord than a small bottle shop, they were willing to agree with the grocery store that there would not be any other retail beer or wine in that shopping center. So
Awesome.
basically they were
Boom you
politely
out.
telling me to find a new place. They're not
How
going to renew
many,
my lease.
how much notice did you get? Because it sounds like you were staying in that space, assuming that you were going to just renew with that 5 year extension, or
Well, no, he had already done a 5-year extension 4 years ago, so there was only
oh,
1 year left on his lease. It was actually ending that October. So when I started looking at it in March, I said a year. It was less than a year. It was
6 months.
from March to October.
Yeah.
I bought the place in June. And so between June and October is when they dropped that bomb on me. They didn't tell me that ahead of time. When they were involved in me taking over that business and being assigned the lease and all that, they never said anything about the grocery store chain. So probably August, September timeframe, they dropped that bomb on me, and they were very, oh, we'll help you find another place in another one of our shopping centers. Well, every one of their big shopping centers had a grocery store in it, so it was a moot point. I wasn't able to move to another one of their locations, so I had to go out on my own. And they were willing. They knew it'd be like a 12 to 18 month time frame before they could actually get that grocery store in there. A gym had left a large space, and they were going to turn that gym into the grocery store. And they said, look, it's going to take 12 to 18 months to do that. We're willing to extend you month to month, because, hey, they wanted to keep taking my rent while they could, knowing I wasn't going to be long term, but they wouldn't have a space sitting empty. So they let me go month to month until I found a new place, which we can get into that. But looking back, trying to remember the timeline, I found a place late in 22. I'd say summer of 22, I found a place and had to do a lot of upfit and remodeling to turn a garage, a mechanic shop, into a bar and retail front. And that took, I opened in April of 23, just to give you a rough timeline. But they allowed me to go month to month, and then about 6 months after I left, the grocery store actually popped in there and created havoc for all the small businesses, because the parking lots were all of a sudden overtaken by the grocery store, and all their patrons were upset. And I was kind of glad to be out, but that move created a whole nother challenge for me. In less than a year of me being in this entrepreneurial spot, all of a sudden I had to uproot and move, which proved to be a very big challenge.
Well, and it's expensive. When you think about not only the tenant improvements you have to do, but even just the distraction factor that's created.
Yes.
You have to concept a whole new place, and then you got to do the change management with your patrons and your vendors and all your suppliers. It's
absolutely
a lot of work. That was your big surprise. You bought the business, and it's time for you to move.
So my piece of advice for anybody out there listening would be to, yes, read over the lease, which I did, and there were things in there that you like and don't like if you're assuming a lease, but really dig in deep with that landlord and find out what future growth expectations they have. Hey, am I going to be able to sign another long-term lease with you? I asked some of the questions that I failed to ask that may have revealed hey, we're going to give you the boot in 6 months after you get here.
Yeah, assuming they'll tell you. In my experience, the fastest way
Right.
to get that information is you try to negotiate an extension with them on the lease. Meaning, if you know you've only got 6 months left when you're taking over this business, you start negotiating with the landlord now, because that will tell you more about what
Yep.
they plan in terms of what they're willing to do or not do going forward.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I agree.
So it sounds like it was critical that you had a financial plan that left you with significant reserves, because that allowed you to not stress as much about the move, because you could invest in doing it well and not have to just take whatever space was available and do it poorly and potentially hurt your brand.
It did not eliminate stress, but it allowed me to survive.
That's fair.
Yeah, I started this at 54 years ago, and I'm 65 now.
Russ, why don't you talk to us just for a couple minutes, because I know we're going to run short of time here. Just tell us, since taking over the business, how has your life changed? What are the things that you've learned about you or the business? Where has it worked out the way better than you expected or worse than you expected?
Um, so being your own boss, you still have stress, but it's a different kind of stress. And I think it's, for me personally, it's a more manageable stress. For some other people, I've talked to, they would never want to do this because that stress would be monumental compared to the stress of dealing with a boss in a corporate environment. Um, I think I was a little unlucky with this move that was forced upon me very early on in me taking this venture. And while I think I found a great spot, I found a great landlord. I did find a spot that had no grocery store chain, didn't even have space for a grocery store. And it was a small local individual landlord versus a conglomerate out of New York. And he was very welcoming to me because his garage had been sitting there empty for 2 years. So he was a motivated seller, if you will. And he worked with me in every way possible. He put a lot of capital into renovating my structure, not as much as I did, but he did put a lot of capital into things that had to be changed that would never leave. If I left, those things would still be there and be an
Yeah.
asset for him. So that part was great, but what was unfortunate and what has really caused me a lot of consternation or more stress is the fact that that neighborhood that I moved into, while it was only about 5 miles away, it was a different zip code, a different demographic, slightly. Like I said earlier, it was a little bit lower median income, but they did spend more on alcohol. But I just have not been able to I've been there now in April. So in 3 months, I will have been there 2 years in the new location operating. And I have yet to reach the revenue level that I was at the previous location.
Yeah.
Um, you know, the previous location was much higher revenue on retail and much less on bar because of the way the previous owner set it up.
Yep.
At the new spot, my bar revenue is 90% of my total revenue. So I've really lost that retail nugget that was supporting the business. It just did a complete flop. It went from 80-20 retail to 90-10 bar.
Yeah.
And my margins are great. My traffic is great, but I've not accomplished, I'm about half of the monthly revenue I was at the other place.
That's a significant shift.
I
So,
have a bigger brand new space at a lower rent. So that's all good.
yeah.
My expenses are not higher, but my revenue has not reached the level that I was at the other place. But
Well,
again, I was kind of forced out of that too. I didn't make that
yeah.
decision as a,
And it sounds like there's an important lesson there for someone coming in, is that, we talk about in real estate how location matters. I mean,
yep,
you're highlighting it. It makes a big, big difference, especially for something like retail. You can think 5 miles isn't that far away, but 5 miles changes buying behavior. Like, there's only
yep,
certain things I'm willing to drive 5 miles to go get.
yeah,
So I'm interested to hear, Russ, originally when you went down this path of a bottle house, you had chosen that concept because you liked that it was recession proof, right? This idea that the retail was going to be what could carry you in the times where the bar community part suffered. And now with the move, the P&L has sort of flipped in terms of where your dollars are coming from. So how do you think about navigating that risk and what comes next for the business?
It's interesting. I'm meeting with people not every day, but quite often on helping me revise my concept and my model, because I think what I moved into is an area that is spending a lot more money on the lower end stuff that I really didn't have in my model. At my bar, you're not going to find the cheap domestic long necks and the boxed wine and the
Yeah.
low end alcohol. I'm upscale, and so I think that neighborhood doesn't support the upscale craft beer, fine wine, spirits that I had my model built around. And I did figure out that while there was not a true bottle shop and bar in my old location bubble, there was a fine wine shop. Well, that's all they did was sell wine. They didn't have the bar, they didn't get into beer, and they didn't do spirits. And most of my wine customers who were buying those mixed cases every week had transitioned to that wine shop that was still in their bubble, which still had the high end wine, the small boutique wineries.
Yep.
So I think I lost a lot of my existing customer base. And while I had built a new customer base, that's not their thing, is the fine wine, craft beer, high end spirits, So yes, location, 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 but it doesn't just matter what the brick and mortar looks like. You really got to study that demographic and the buying habits, like you said, of that new
Yeah.
neighborhood.
Well, there's an important lesson there too. I think a lot of people believe that if they invest in a franchise, that every franchise location is going to work out exactly like the other ones do. And what you're highlighting is that it matters where you're at. In fact, at one point, I owned a massage franchise, and we were convinced that we were going to blow this thing up because we were really good at marketing, and we did great with the marketing. But what we overestimated was how difficult it was going to be to keep staff in this really high-end area where we could charge higher prices and drive lots of people in the store, but we couldn't keep people because none of them lived anywhere near where we were trying to serve. So I think that's a key thing. Knowing what you know today, Russ, if you were going back in time, your landlord tells you to move, how would you have handled that real estate choice differently?
I think about that all the time. And while I think I did good homework, and believe me, I pursued two other places before I landed where I'm at now.
Yeah.
And there were big red flags that popped up during those two other negotiations, if you will, where I met with the landlords, brought the attorneys, and we were ironing out the deal, and red flags started popping up, which caused me to exit. I didn't really see any of those red flags where I'm at now. So maybe I was a little bit desperate to make this move happen, and I didn't really do enough research. So I would say overanalyze. Overanalyze every aspect if you have to move, or if you're looking at a place to start the new business, not moving it, but just your initial location. Overanalyze.
Russ, it sounded like in the search process, you were really deliberate about the demographic data. Were you as deliberate when you were looking for the second place?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I did not want a kitchen, so I didn't want to run food and be a restaurant or a kitchen as well as a bar. So my number one deal breaker was there had to be a neighbor tenant that had really good food that folks could get and bring into my shop and enjoy their favorite beverage with a food that matched up. And so, the previous two locations that I didn't go through with had that partnership next door with a good eatery, but too many things fell apart with the landlord or his future plans or whatever that caused me to keep looking and land at this third place. I still got the neighbor eateries in that shopping center that I thought would help me and not be detrimental because I didn't have a kitchen of my own.
Got it. Well, Russ, I know we're running short on time here, so I'd love, the experience that you've gone through over the last 4 years. If someone came to you and said, "Hey, I'm in the process of looking to buy or start a business. what's your single best piece of advice you would give them based on the road that you've walked?
Well, hands down, I think the ROBS is a great concept. So that part's a no-brainer for me. I would just say, overanalyze. Even though it's in your blood and you've got that entrepreneurial spirit, that's not enough. You've got to really analyze every aspect and pull in as many experts as partners. They don't have to be financial partners, but partners on helping you succeed. Surround yourself with good people, overanalyze every detail. But as far as the ROBS concept, I think it's a great concept.
I wasn't necessarily asking for the ROBS plug, but appreciate it. Russ, really appreciate you taking the time, man. I love the bottle house concept. We don't have much of that here in the state of Idaho, where all of the liquor is controlled by the state. But it sounds like a really cool blend of solving a business problem and creating this connection to your community that you desired in this sort of semi-retirement. I'm picturing it as this bridge between your corporate career and your sort of third part of your life when you'll fully retire. And this is kind of giving you a sense of purpose and a challenge, keeping you sharp.
Yep, so I would agree.
Thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Create the Life You Want podcast. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to future episodes by clicking the subscribe button, you know where. If you're an aspiring business owner, you may also want to subscribe to the Create the Life You Want newsletter for more inspiration and tips delivered to your inbox every week. You can find the link to that in the show notes, as well as on my personal website, jeremyames.com. If you've already decided you want to start or buy a business, consider exploring your financing options by heading to our sponsor's website at www.guidantfinancial.com. That's GUIDANT financial.com. See you in the next episode.